How's it going? I'm Boomer Trujillo, and basically, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to start the series of videos that I use for my critical thinking class. And today, we're starting a series of videos called Critical Thinking Basics, and we're going to do the first video tonight, which is on definitions. Before we get into that, though, I just want to say a little bit kind of about the series and what I think it's probably going to do. And that is basically this. In these critical thinking basics videos, what I have in mind is that I want to introduce core concepts in critical thinking. And what I mean by critical thinking, especially in this context, is finding ways of evaluating language and evaluating arguments. Whenever we are writing things down or speaking with one another, typically we can have lots of different reasons for doing that. But anytime we're sharing information or basically trying to get someone to believe some sort of conclusion, that's where I want these videos to really find their purpose. Broadly, I think that these videos are probably most at home in something like an academic context, academic discourse. And what I mean by that is very often when people are using language academically, and I don't just mean what professors do or something like that, I mean people are usually speaking literally as opposed to figuratively. So we're trying to use our words to mean exactly what they mean. We're not trying to veil it behind metaphors, or we're not trying to tell a story, or not maybe just trying to share our emotions. As wonderful and important as those things might be for life in general, what I'm trying to show is, whenever we're reading, for example, journalism, or whenever we're reading a nonfiction book, or whenever we're listening to a debate on TV, that is a very specific kind of language where people are just trying to speak straightforwardly. That's what I really want to focus on. That way in which we use language to share information, not just to persuade, meaning get people to do what you want them to do, not just to evoke emotion, right? Where we're first and foremost focusing on how you feel. Rather, we're focusing on the words, the arguments, the sort of information and the evidence that can be presented to do something. That's what we're going to try and focus in on. So, to that end, let's start talking. I said we were going to talk about definitions, so it's really important to talk about language, and I need to basically make some really fundamental distinctions that are going to help us to really understand things. The first thing that I should just say is language is magic. I mean, it really is this fascinating tool. It seems to be something that is probably unique to humans. Who knows? As we get better and better science, it seems like animals can use various forms of communication. Right? I think dolphins and maybe whales might even have names for each other. Plants can communicate certain things, but the level of complexity and abstraction that we achieve in language is really it's astounding. Just think about, as I have here on the puppy kisses versus nails on chalkboard, I'm just using words to potentially conjure images in your mind. If I talk about puppy kisses or bringing your dog home for the first time or something like that, that is something that conjures a way different set of associations than talking about nails on a chalkboard or talking about someone making the worst kinds of sounds or annoying things in the world. You don't even have to be there. We can just talk about it in the abstract, and you're immediately getting images, you're immediately making associations. That's really fascinating with respect to language. But whenever your words aren't working well, they can also kind of do nothing. So one thing is words can just produce gibberish. So what I have here is an example of what's called word salad. Um, Perhaps worryingly, although this just kind of happens in clinical settings, you might worry, for example, if there's a patient and whenever they are trying to talk to you, they like the sentences don't make sense. They're using English words because we're speaking English right now, right? But they don't make sense. So, for example, headphones blue, comment below expand, right? Headphones blue, comment below expand. That doesn't really make any sense. It's gibberish. It's word salad. One of the reasons why you might worry about that in a clinical setting is you might worry that someone's having a stroke, and in particular, having a stroke in one of the language centers of their brain. But the other thing that can kind of keep us from really meaning anything is speaking in what are called tautologies. Tautologies are just by definition true things, and usually it's because the subject and whatever attributes you're ascribing to something are exactly the same thing. So it is what it is, or today is today, tomorrow is tomorrow. Those kinds of things, they're true, but they don't really add any information. They don't really help us to understand things. Now, if we say something like, it is what it is, what we might be communicating non literally is something like resignation. I can't do anything about it. It is what it is, so I'm just gonna let it be. I can't do anything about it, so I'm gonna move on with my life, right? But again, what we're doing here is we're trying to understand the meaning of words in the most literal way possible. Now, as I have already admitted, and I'll even talk about later in the presentation, words can have meaning outside of this, and it is often important to talk about this kind of stuff. But for now, we're just thinking about those literal meanings. I want to take the point even further, though, because I think that there is something really important about learning how to use language, because I think in a certain way it does reflect on our character. I think it's really, really important. This is something that ChatGPT or that people who never pay attention to their language will never be able to do, I don't think. Um, and it's that good people are people who typically, or maybe I should have reversed this actually. What I'm trying to say is you can learn something about who someone is by listening to how they talk. And in particular, whenever you're really zeroing in on people who are good writers or good speakers, they do a few things that I think it's really, really important to mention explicitly. One is good speakers, good writers, they know their subject really well. So, I'm not saying that you have to be a genius in a subject. You could potentially, take a class on something. Maybe you read a couple of really authoritative books on a subject. I think that's probably good enough in some contexts. But the point is, you don't just make stuff up. You respect whatever you're trying to convey and you learn about it. You know your subject really well. I think that's really important. For example, I'm a professor. We're teaching critical thinking right now. It's really important for you as students to know that I have spent a lot of time thinking about these things, reading books, doing all sorts of stuff to kind of like gain my competence. To that end, maybe very quickly, I will mention one book that I'm probably going to be building a lot off of, and this is an old edition, but it has a lot of notes. This is a book called Logic by Stan Baronet. It's published by Oxford University Press. I think it's really solid. I have a bunch of other books that I could recommend if, in case anyone wants books to understand a lot of stuff. But Stan Baronet deserves a special shout out with respect to what we're talking about. I think also good writers and good speakers know who their audience is. um it's really an easy point to neglect because we just kind of assume that our audience is going to have the same base knowledge or the same reasons for why they're listening to us or thinking about things. That's not the case. Depending on the audience, they could be sympathetic, they could like you, they could want to listen to whatever you're trying to convey. They could be hostile, meaning that they don't want to listen. You're going to approach those audiences very differently. So when you're approaching a sympathetic audience, you can be informal, you can be loose. When you're approaching a hostile audience, you need to get to the point and you need to appeal to their values, right? Which probably are going to be different than yours. And I think that there's a couple of things that we could talk about with respect to this. Again, not go into deep conversation about it, but to earmark as something that's important to understand this. One thing that I think is really important is to note the difference between speaking esoterically and exoterically. This is really important because if I am talking to other philosophy professors, I might not make the same kinds of qualifications. I might not do all of the steps in an argument because I think that my audience will be able to follow along. Now, if it's something really important, I think that it's always good to say explicitly what the important terms mean. Nonetheless, you can skip some stuff whenever you're talking with an insider group. That's what it means for something to be esoteric, to sort of be inward facing. Just kind of like if you're a musician and you're speaking to other musicians, you can use music theory or code or something like that to convey something. Whereas if you're speaking to people who aren't musicians, you have to frame messages in a different way. That's what it means for something to be exoteric. It's outward facing. You're communicating to people who might not have the same sort of knowledge. Similarly, culturally, code switching is really big. I am using my sort of run-of-the-mill academic voice. I am not speaking, in an accent that I learned, whether it was like in Texas or New Mexico or mixing in Spanglish, whatever else it is. I'm speaking in a relatively neutral way just to make sure that we can kind of understand each other. Now, sometimes people will switch between things. That's what code switching is. But it's also important to realize that the way that we speak, the vocabulary that we speak, the metaphors that we use can include or exclude people, and that's up to you as a communicator whenever you're doing these things. Now, again, in these contexts, you want to include anyone who's willing to listen. You probably want to cast the widest net in the sense of using language that's inclusive, using a context that's relatively wide, trying to make sure that you explain everything explicitly, etc. And the third point here is that I think that good writers, good speakers, basically know how to meet their audience wherever they are to convey their subject as easily as possible. That's really, really important. I think that one of the reasons why language can convey something about your character is that sometimes people can use, and this is the last point on the slide, obscure language or jargon or specialized stuff or really weird metaphors to exclude people. And that kind of like exclusionary approach to language are basically saying, I don't have to write clearly. And in fact, I'm going to write obscurely because if you're not on my level, I don't want you to understand me. That's certainly something that you could do. I don't think that it's something that you should do, at least in the context that we're talking about here. Now, generally speaking, and this is the last of the good writer's points, you kind of have to know what the purpose is for you talking or what the purpose is for you writing. That can affect how you're conveying what you're going to convey. But generally speaking, again, know your subject, know your audience. And if you're a good speaker in this context, I think what you're going to try to do is to meet your audience wherever they are and convey the information as best you can to help them out. That's kind of what we're dealing with here. But, and I think this is really important because a lot of mistakes in academic writing. One of the reasons academic writing can be so terrible to read, or if you've ever read a contract or spoken with a lawyer, I think the same thing applies to their kind of writing. We have to acknowledge that basically we can't say everything. And so what I'm giving here is what I'm going to call the tour guide theory of language or argumentation. You won't be able to convey everything. Okay. I think this is especially the case in a single speech or a single paper or something like that. You just can't do everything. But what you can do is you can hit the important things. You can hit the important points. Just like whenever you go on a tour, you don't try to see everything on a tour. Rather, a tour guide draws your attention to what the most important things are, gives you history, gives you context to try and make sense of stuff. Now, the tour guide is probably also going to be a relative expert of the area, such that if people have questions, the tour guide will be able to answer those questions, right? But a tour guide doesn't try to cover everything. They just hit the highlights. And the tour guide can repeat things if it seems like the audience isn't getting it, or if they want to be extra sure that an audience will get a point, because if it's repeated, typically it's taken that it's an important thing. But generally speaking, what we should sort of emphasize here is that the map or the symbol or the tour is not really going to be the same thing as a city. And I want to share a very quick short story that illustrates this, I think, really well. And it's cryptic, but it's okay. This is a story called On Rigor in Science by the writer Jorge Luis Borges. And this is the entire story. Now I'm going to read this just for the sake of expanding on this point. But but I also just want to read Borges and make sure that you, as an educated person, kind of like know who he is. So he wrote a lot of like philosophical short stories. The Library of Babel, for example, The Garden of Forking Paths. Those two get talked about pretty frequently in philosophy, and he's a just a giant in Latin American literature. But here's the story that I think is most relevant for our context here, and it is this: in that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied an entire city, and the map of the empire an entire province. In time, these excessive maps did not satisfy, and the schools of cartographers built a map of the empire that was of the size of the empire, and which coincided point for point with it. Less addicted to the study of cartography, the following generations understood that the dilated map was useless, and not without pitilessness, they delivered it to the inclemencies of the sun and the winters. In the deserts of the West endure broken ruins of the map, inhabited by animals and beggars. In the whole country, there is no other relic of the disciplines of geography. So it's kind of cryptic. I don't even know if you picked up, but basically what happened is there was this city that was obsessed with map making, and originally what they tried to do is basically make a map, for example, of the state of Kentucky be the size of the city of Louisville. So you could get a ton of detail, right? You get a ton of detail in Kentucky if you had a Louisville size map of it. But this wasn't enough for those people. Eventually, they made a map of Kentucky the size of Kentucky. And it was a 1-to-1 ratio. But the later generations just thought that that was useless. What I'm trying to convey with this particular short story is that symbols are really useful. Language is really useful. We can't really convey everything in our language. If we could, it would just be like super exhaustive. We have to take shortcuts because we don't have everyone's undivided attention forever, and we don't need to go into all the details. And so that's why it's really, really important for us to exercise what's often called the principle of charity. The principle of charity, and we'll talk about it later in some later videos too, is basically whenever you're listening to someone, especially an opponent, you should give them the benefit of the doubt and you should interpret their argument in the strongest way possible or reconstruct it in a way that they would agree that you basically understood what they were saying. And that's because we realize humans are flawed. Language is always adapting. What we're doing can only convey so much. So we need to be judicious with respect to what we're doing. But in having these conversations about language, what we very quickly start to discover is that we need languages to analyze our language, and that's where meta languages comes in. So broadly, one of the things that I really, really need to make sure that you come away with is this distinction between the object or the natural language and the meta language or the formal language. Okay, so the object language, or sometimes the natural language, is just what we use every day. So if you're speaking English, or if you're speaking Spanish, or if you're speaking German, or if you're speaking, Vietnamese, that is an example of a natural language. The way that people talk with each other, that is typically just the object language. We're not really thinking too much about it. It's the first order language. It's just us naturally moving around in the world. So on this slide, I put the examples of I like burritos or Ich mag burritos, which is German for the same exact thing. Now, if we wanted to talk about how we were using our language, so not just use language, but talk about how we're using the language, then what we need to do is develop a meta language. And the meta language is the formal or the artificial language that we use to analyze the object or the ordinary language. So what we're doing is we're doing a sort of analytic or semantic ascent. We're speaking in an object language, but then we develop a meta language to analyze what's going on in that object language, right? We speak a natural language, but then we use an artificial or a formal language to analyze what's going on in that natural language. And so if we go back to those sentences of I like burritos or ich mag burritos, then we can use a meta language to talk about those sentences. So I could say those sentences have 3 words, or those sentences have a subject, a verb, and a direct object. But whenever we're talking about those sentences themselves and not just using them like we would whenever we normally talk, what we've done is we've created a meta language where we're analyzing those sentences themselves. Okay. So, for example, the word taco, I could just say tacos are delicious. But if I also said taco has 4 letters, whenever I say taco has 4 letters, the taco in that sentence, you know that I'm not talking about the object. You know that I'm talking about the symbol. And so that is a really, really important distinction. And it's exactly this distinction, which is the use versus mention distinction. Use versus mention. And the first point on this slide is mind the quotes. Be really careful about the quotes, because that's often something that can help us figure out whether we're using a phrase or whether we're mentioning a phrase. And so what I mean by that is whenever we are engaging in use, what we're doing is we're using the words in a natural language. Tacos have many ingredients. If I just say that sentence, tacos have many ingredients, you know what I'm saying? I'm talking about tacos, talking about ingredients, talking about how you can put all sorts of stuff inside of a tortilla and make it really, really delicious. Whereas in mention, again, we're going into that meta language. We're ascending in order to analyze what's going on. I can put the word tacos in quotes, and then I can say tacos has 5 letters. So you know that it would be absurd of me to say that tacos has 5 letters and I'm talking about an object. By using quotes, what I'm doing is whatever I put inside of those quotes is what I'm trying to analyze. And in this case, I am mentioning tacos as a symbol, as a word. I am not using tacos as a reference to the actual object itself. Rather, I am mentioning, or I'm using my meta language to talk about the symbol, to talk about the word, to talk about the phrase, not to talk about the object itself, right? Tacos can have many ingredients. Tacos typically do not have letters inside of them, unless we had like alphabet tacos or whatever. But that's that's not what I'm talking about. That's not what I'm talking about here, right? So whenever you want to talk about the symbol itself, use quotation marks to basically draw attention to that word or to that symbol. So if you look at the difference between those 2 sentences, between use and mention, in the use, there are no quotations because you're just using it like normal. But in the mention, I've put quotation marks around tacos to emphasize that I'm talking about the word, not about the object. So we can use quotes to refer to the symbol rather than the thing itself. So the use versus mention distinction is really, really important, because we could get confused very easily as to whether we're talking about the object or the symbol referring to that object. So we have the natural language, and then we have the meta language, right? We have the object language and the meta language. We have the natural language and the formal language. We also have use versus mention. But the point is, most of the time, we're just using words. Most of the time, we're just speaking in natural language. But sometimes, what we're doing in this class, what we're doing in this video, what we're doing is going up a level so that we can talk about the stuff that we naturally do, but in this way where we're able to analyze stuff and figure out what's going wrong and maybe what's going right. Okay, what's the point? Well, the point is this stuff is allowing us to be more precise. It's really important to be precise in debates where we're trying to figure out what's going on. And one of the ways that we do that is we can try to avoid these 3 things, because these 3 things will very often undermine what we're trying to convey. The first one is ambiguity, the second is vagueness, and the third is equivocation. So ambiguity and vagueness, I think, kind of like in common language, probably are almost the same thing to most people, but to philosophers or to rhetoricians or to linguists, there's a really important difference. A word is ambiguous if it has more than one meaning. So for example, take the sentence, The test came back negative, right? The test came back negative. That same exact sentence could have good and bad meanings depending on what that test is for, right? So if it's a COVID test, that's really, really great. But if it's a test for something that you wanted, then that's not such so good, right? So maybe if this is an odd phrasing, but maybe we could think of like a driver's test. You wouldn't want to fail a driver's test or something like that. Now, again, the sentence doesn't quite work here, but maybe someone is trying to start a family, and it's a pregnancy test. You're trying to see whether you're pregnant or not. The test coming back negative could be bad news potentially to people who are trying to start a family. But that same exact sentence, again, depending on the context, can have multiple meanings. Or we could take a simpler example, something like figure. Figure in mathematics could mean like a diagram, or in logic, it could mean a diagram. In a drawing class, it could mean something that you're sculpting, or maybe you have a live model in class. In fashion, maybe it can mean something like the build of someone's body, right? One word can have multiple meanings, and if it has multiple meanings, then that word is ambiguous. And you could, if you speak Spanish, you can think of ambos or both. That's what's going on here. Relatedly, although different, is vagueness. And whenever a term is vague, basically what it means is that it's lacking a clear meaning. And there's a lot of really great examples. So there's a paradox about Plato's beard, for example. So if you were to take my beard and pluck out one hair, would I lose my beard? How many beards or how many beard hairs would you have to pluck out before I lost my beard? Same sort of thing with bald. At what point are you bald? So like I've got some thinning on my crown. I'm not a young pup anymore. Am I bald? Well, I don't know. Is Danny DeVito bald? I mean, he doesn't have any hair on the top of his head, but he has hair on the sides of his head, right? Or do you have to be completely bald to be bald? In a case like vagueness, what's going on is there is no clear definition. In ambiguity, you have a plethora of definitions that will change depending on context. In vagueness, there's just not really a clear definition. Now, generally speaking, we might understand kind of broadly what's going on, but it's vague. It's unclear. We don't have, very discrete or determinate guidelines for what's going on with the particular terms. Now, the reason why these can be problems is because of a fallacy called equivocation. A fallacy is just a sort of mistake in argumentation, or a mistake in the way that we speak whenever we're trying to get people to believe something or connect evidence to a conclusion. Equivocation is a fallacy because basically what it identifies is sometimes we can shift between multiple definitions of the same word without realizing it. So that's a sort of unintentional equivocation. Maybe I define, for example, because I do a lot of ethics, happiness in one way, but philosophers actually mean happiness in a second way. And I shift between the two definitions whenever what I should have been doing is just staying focused on one definition. But in a more malicious way, some people will equivocate in order to hide the fact that they don't actually have a clear definition. So people can intentionally equivocate to just cover up the fact that they don't really know what they're talking about. But equivocation happens whenever one term that has multiple meanings, or maybe no clear meaning at all, is used in a lot of ways, and it obscures the fact that basically under the words, the concepts are not very clear. The concepts are shifting around. Ideally, in an argument or in a situation where we're sharing information, we want all of our terms to be clear. We want all of our terms to have exactly one meaning in the context that we're using it. And if there are multiple meanings for the word, we want to explicitly mention whenever we're shifting between meanings. All of this is basically just to help us to use our language to be as precise as possible. We want to avoid ambiguity, meaning having multiple definitions going on at the same time. We want to avoid vagueness, meaning lacking any clear definition at all. And we want to avoid equivocation in the sense that if there's a word that does have lots of meanings or doesn't have a clear meaning, we want to avoid that. We want to use our terms as important as possible. Now, are you going to do this for every single term in an argument? Absolutely not. That's way too much. But you need to make sure that you're doing this for the most important terms in a particular argument. So, as I said, I wanted to give you a complication here. So I started the video saying that what we're talking about here is critical thinking. What we're talking about is logic. What we're talking about is sort of like nonfiction, maybe journalism, something like that. What we are not talking about is art, because there is something like art or comedy or wit where these things might be helpful. And what's good for art might not be good for logic, and what's good for logic might not be good for art. And you could think especially of something like the double entendre. So meaning that there's two meanings to what's going on. And one of my favorite examples is from one of my comfort movies, which is Grumpier Old Men. This is the sequel to Grumpy Old Men, and it stars Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau and Sophia Loren there in the green sweater or the green sweater as well. But basically, the guy in the overalls there, he has a really big crush on the woman in the green sweater, and he is rehearsing pickup lines with his friend there. And he rehearses this particular line: Maria, there may be lots of fish in the sea, but you're the only one I would like to mount over my fireplace. And he thinks that he's being really clever because mount over his fireplace. He's a fisherman. You mount a fish because you're proud of it, right? But he thinks he's also being romantic and talking about mounting mounting his love interest, and he's being very clever. Now, he eventually messes up this pickup line, but he thinks he's doing something clever there. In double entendre, we might depend on the ambiguity of the word so that we say one thing, but it could be taken as something else. Similarly, there's this really old science fiction story called "To Serve Men" by an author named Damon Knight. And basically, an alien species comes to Earth, and we're learning their language, and we're learning interactions. And basically, they decide that they want to offer the opportunity for humans to go on their spaceship as sort of like a delegation, right? Well, that's not everything that's conveyed. And so what I've done here is I've spoiled the story because I've included a very truncated version of the last few paragraphs, where one character is basically saying these aliens are not good, and the other character is like, but I thought they were. Okay, so the skeptical character says they're not altruists. The aliens aren't altruists. And the sympathetic character says, well, what about the book? What about that? How to Serve Men, which was the title of the book. That wasn't put there for you to read. They mean it. How do you explain that? So the sympathetic character is saying they have these manuals. This manual says how to serve men. You got a copy of it. Like, how do you explain that away? If they're not altruists, why would they have a book called How to Serve Men? The skeptical person says, I've read the first paragraph. The other person says, well? The skeptical person says, he smiled, it's a cookbook. So, in case you didn't catch that, the aliens come to Earth with a book called How to Serve Men. The sympathetic and excited people think, oh, they're trying to help us out, right? They're this interstellar species. But the skeptic, the person who learns to translate it, eventually figures out that How to Serve Men isn't a book about serving men in the sense of service, but it's a book about serving men in the sense of food or a dish. And so, it's kind of a funny punchline, but I think it illustrates the point. In art, again, the ambiguity can be used for misdirection, and that's like often part of the fun of jokes or something like that. There are many comedians who use ambiguity and misdirection much to their effect. Okay, but I also want to emphasize, please use logic here. Please use logic here. If you want to do art, you totally should. Art is really amazing, especially art of the written word. Go take classes and learn the craft. But here, in the context of these videos and the classes that I'm in, use logic first and foremost, please, rather than emotion or art or figurative language or whatever else. Okay. Now, the whole reason that I'm emphasizing this is that definitions are really important. In fact, there are many debates in politics that hinge on terms being defined clearly. That's really, really important. So you, as a person who wants to become competent in language and argumentation, you need to try to take great pains to define your important terms as well as possible. Now, again, the symbol will not be the thing. That's the thing. If you make the map as big as the city, it just is the city. Okay. So the symbol can't represent everything. That's fine. But sometimes you can offer a definition that's gonna help you focus in on what you're trying to talk about, what you're trying to analyze. And what's important to emphasize here, although there's a typo on the slide here, good definitions strengthen arguments. Whenever you're clear, whenever you've talked about the essential components, whenever you're really understanding what you're talking about, it makes everything easier to understand. Inversely, bad definitions weaken arguments. Whenever your definition is unclear, or it's ambiguous, or it's vague, or you're equivocating, you're shifting between lots of definitions, that actually makes your argument much, much worse. And any astute audience is going to be able to pick up on that. So definitions are really, really important. And if you don't have good definitions, that is one of the core ways in which an argument can be significantly weakened. Okay, so let's talk about definitions. One of the things that we first might say is, whenever I use the word term, even though I've used it for half an hour already, what I mean by term is basically a word or a phrase or a symbol that's the subject of a statement. So in grade school you might call it the subject noun, right? That is all I mean by the term. The subject noun, the subject phrase, whatever else it is. If you are the artist formerly known as Prince, you have a literal symbol, right? But the word, the phrase, or the symbol, that's the subject of the statement. And then a definition is just assigning a particular meaning to that word or that phrase or that symbol. So we have a term, and then the definition helps us to understand what we mean whenever we're using that particular term. That's what we're doing whenever we're trying to define words. Now, this is one of the core things. I'm going to take a sip of my tea before I get to this distinction. So there's two types of definitions, and I think that this is like one of the most useful distinctions in logic, in philosophy of language, in rhetoric, all sorts of stuff that you could use this. Intentional definitions and extensional definitions. Now, one of the things that you should pick up on is intentional here has an S. It does not have a T. I've capitalized it, not normally capitalized, but I've capitalized it just to make it very clear. Intention is the noun, intentional is the adjective. But intentional definitions, or to talk about the intention of a word, is to talk about its sense or its connotation. Okay. But what that generally means is, if you can only remember one word to think about the intention, it's the properties. So whenever you are giving an intentional definition of a word, what you're doing is you're specifying the meaning by listing the properties of the term. Sometimes you can do this with synonyms. Sometimes you can do this by offering an etymology and talking about the origin of the term. Sometimes you can set up an operational definition and say how it's being used in a given context. But what you're doing when you're dealing with the intention is you're trying to get the connotation straight. You're trying to get the sense of the term straight. You're trying to offer a definition by giving properties. Now, that's probably not going to be super clear, but it will be clear once we talk about extension right now as kind of the contrast. So an extensional definition, or talking about the extension of a term, is talking about its reference or its denotation. What you do whenever you're defining a term extensionally is you're trying to specify what that term means by denoting what class of objects it picks out. And you can do this via ostension, literally by pointing, like that and that and that and that. So what does that mean? Well, it means that. It picks out that. It picks out that. You can do it by enumeration. You create a list of things that term picks out. Or you could kind of create classes and subclasses. So biology does this in taxonomy, right? For example, we have all mammals, but then we might have primates within mammals, right? And that does not that doesn't pick out canines, right? It picks out primates. So you can use classes and subclasses. So intention is trying to, if you want to think about it in terms of concept, in terms of the thought, in terms of like trying to figure out what that thing is, Extension is a little more concrete in the sense that you're talking about objects. You're talking about specific instances about how that term is used. Okay. Now I'm gonna go forward, but I just want to repeat really quickly. Intension is about the sense or the connotation. You're talking about the properties of a term. Extension is about the reference or the denotation. You're talking about the objects or the class of the things that are pointed out. Okay, so here's a little diagram. So what we can do is, generally speaking, whenever we're thinking about defining something, we can think about what we're doing is defining a class of things. Now this is leaning very heavily into the extensional definitions, but the orange circle there, the circle there, represents a class of objects. Okay, the big gray rectangle is just the domain, the overall scope of things, everything that exists in the context of what you're talking about. So maybe I have a very specific context. Maybe I'm in medicine, and maybe I'm in something like orthopedic surgery. So I'm only talking about musculoskeletal issues. So someone who blew out their shoulder or tore a pec or whatever else it is, right? But nonetheless, in the context, there's a lot of stuff going on. That's the domain. That's like the biggest thing. That's what's symbolized by the gray rectangle. Now there's a lot of things, so that's represented by the gray dots, or any of the dots on the screen, including our orange circle. What we're doing when we're offering a class is we are encircling some of those things and excluding others. So whenever we define a class, what we're defining is a group of objects, and its complement is basically anything outside of that group of objects. So the class is what's inside the circle. The complement is what's outside the circle. Okay, so if I define, for example, bone fractures in a medical context, I am excluding anything that's not a bone fracture. Okay, that's just what it means to draw a distinction. So this is, whenever I am referring to classes, that's all I'm talking about here. Take everything. To form a class means to put a group of these things together and to say that represents the particular term. Okay, so I just wanted to make sense. Now, one of the other things that can happen is, again, this is the groups and subgroups, or classes and subclasses kind of thing, the genera versus the species. You could also make subdistinctions. So you could have classes within classes, but all a class is, again, is just a group of objects. It includes some things, it excludes other things. All right. So let's take in a word that's probably like pretty difficult to define, but it has some philosophical legacy. And let's try and define what it means to be human. Okay. Plato famously, and this is a story recounted by a sort of historian named Diogenes Laertius. Plato, supposedly the great philosopher, defined humans as featherless bipedal animals. Okay, humans don't have feathers, and we're bipedal in the sense that we walk on two legs. Now, bipedal is interesting, right? Because it excludes quadrupedal animals. We're not dogs, we're not elk, whatever else it is. We walk on two legs. But if you just put bipedal, then he could have been talking about chickens, right? He could have been talking about, storks, whatever else it is, right? They walk on two legs, so that's why he says featherless, because the other bipeds, they are they're birds. So we don't have feathers. That's what makes us us. So what we're trying to do here intentionally is list the properties that it means to be human. Now, maybe it's not a very good definition in that part, but extensionally, what we're really trying to make sure that we do is remember that whenever we're defining a class of things, we want to include the right stuff and we want to exclude the right stuff. So if we're trying to define human, whatever definition we offer that is picking what goes inside the circle, it should include all humans, and it should not exclude any humans. Moreover, there should be no non-humans that are in the circle. It should only be non-humans outside the circle. There should be no humans that end up outside the circle rather than inside the circle. That's what we're trying to do if you want to think about that definition. So Plato his best guess, at least initially, was humans are featherless bipedal animals. But then a cynic philosopher by the name of Diogenes came to his lecture hall, and he said, "Behold Plato's man." And what he had done is he had plucked a chicken. So what Diogenes had done is he had produced a counter example. And bipedal animal, it's a chicken. This one doesn't have feathers because he took all the feathers off, right? So behold Plato's man. This fits Plato's definition. So it would go inside the circle. But very clearly, a definition of humanity should not have that inside the circle, inside the class of objects, right? So Plato supposedly revised his definition to be humans are featherless bipedal animals with broad nails. So they don't have talons. They have broad nails like our fingernails or our toenails or whatever else. So what this really shows is that, definitions can be honed in over time. What we need to do whenever we're defining things is extensionally, we're including what should be in the middle and excluding what we should be on the outside. We shouldn't have humans on the outside. We shouldn't have non-humans on the inside, right? And we really should be trying to get the sense of the term right in our intentional definitions. So here's a sort of better stab. I think that this is a very Aristotelian definition, although not so succinctly stated anywhere. But maybe what we mean whenever we mean human are animals. We're animals, right? With the capacity for reason, we can think. And recursive language. So that's maybe that's a very in the weeds kind of thing that form complex political communities. So maybe a definition is animals with a capacity for reason that and recursive language that form complex political communities, right? That's an intentional definition because what we're trying to do is really understand what are the most important properties of a human that would pick out all humans, right? Extensionally, and this is a sort of enumerative definition or a list definition, or if I had all of these people in front of me, I could point at them and do ostension. Ostension is just pointing. Extensionally, we could say, what does it mean to be human? Well, Plato, Diogenes, Hipparchia, who's a philosopher, Megan the stallion, although the person, not the stallion, Flea, the bassist, not the insect, right? But what we do in extensional definitions is we pick out particular objects. That's what we try to do. And they kind of go hand in hand, right? You could look at that extension, you could look at that collection of objects, and you could form an intension based on what you see as being common between them. Inversely, you could have an intention, and that's the clue. That's the set of concepts. That's the thing that you use. That's the description that you use to actually go out and pick out the objects that will form the extensional definition. So these two things often work together, but it's important to keep them separate. The intention, again, is the connotation or the sense of the word. You're laying out the properties. The extension is the denotation or the reference or the specific objects or things that the term is supposed to be picking out. You're setting up a class, a group of objects. Now, we should be very clear, and these are Aristotelian categories here. There's a difference in quality and quantity. So the first distinction that we should make here is between a universal and a particular claim. A universal claim specifies a property that applies to every single member of a class. So if I say, for example, another time-tested philosophical phrase, all humans are mortal, all humans are mortal, what I'm saying is, if you meet any human, you will know that it's mortal, because that's what it means to make a universal claim. If I say all humans are whatever, mortal in this case, then I know that any example of a human that I meet also is the mortal. Okay? Now that's different from a particular claim, which just specifies a property for some of the members of the class, not all of the members. So it's a difference between all and some. If I say some humans are athletic, okay? There are some humans that are not athletic, right? But some are very athletic. Now, when I say some, that doesn't mean, like, if you meet a human in the wild, you won't know whether it's athletic or not. You just know that it could be, could not be too, right? So that's the difference between a universal and a particular claim. Universal claims, it's about everyone, or you could say never is it the case, or there are no, absolutely no exceptions to this. Universal, you are trying to say that something is a part of every single member of the class, whether that's a specific thing or not. Okay. Positive and negative is also an important distinction. Positive means that you're giving some specific thing, or you're saying that a member of the class has some specific thing, versus negative is you're saying that a specific thing lacks a certain quality. So positive in this sense doesn't mean like emotional or evaluative necessarily. It just means that you're specifying a property that that thing has. Negative means you're basically saying not something, or they lack something. For example, humans lack feathers. That is a negative attribute of humanity. It's not saying that we have skin, right? That would be positive because we have something. It's saying that we don't have feathers. We're featherless. Okay. So universal versus particular, talking about everything versus just talking about at least one. Positive versus negative, saying what something has versus saying what something lacks. Those things can help us to make distinctions with respect to different definitions. Now, one of the things that I want to say here, and this is I tried to get Midjourney to give us an image of Aristotle having his philosopher senses going off, kind of like Spider-Man has his Spidey senses going off. We should be really, really attentive whenever people use universal claims. Now there are obvious indicators most times for universal claims, because people are typically going to use words like all or never. In no case, in every case, they are using some sort of language that indicates that they are talking about everything in a given class. Okay? Now, one of the reasons why you might want to make a universal claim is that whatever the universal claim is making, you're learning something about every single member in that class. So, for example, if I say that all humans are featherless bipeds with broad nails, it might seem kind of silly, but now I know something about every single human. That's a really big thing. That's a really cool thing. If you can make universal claims, they're super powerful. They can elucidate something that can be central to an argument. Okay? But the downside is universal claims are really easy to disprove. And they're really easy to disprove because you only need one counterexample, right? If you're trying to say that all humans are featherless bipeds, if I find a featherless biped that isn't human, or in this case, I find a human that has feathers, or I find a human who has 4 legs or something like that, then what I've done is I've showed that that claim, that universal claim, can't be true. That universal claim now has to be a particular claim, and we have to say some humans are featherless bipeds, right? Some humans are featherless bipeds with broad nails. So the universal claims are really exciting. If you can get them, it's really wonderful. They're big, they're dramatic. But the downside is if you find just one thing, one counterexample, you find one thing that gets let into the class or gets excluded from the class incorrectly, that universal claim can no longer hold. And the claim has to be shifted from universal to particular, from talking about all to only talking about some. That's the big thing here. Your philosopher sensor should go off whenever people say all or never, in no case, in every case, something like that, because people are making a very, very strong claim that is probably pretty easy to defeat depending on what's going on. Okay. Now, one of the things that I think that is also important to mention is, with a lot of definitions, what people are generally trying to do is talk about the essence of something. The essence of something. Now, you'll hear about essentialism, or you'll hear about essential definitions. Sometimes that can be taken in a pejorative way, like, aren't you being an essentialist? Aren't you saying that all, for example, all humans have to be this or whatever? So again, it's one of these things where if you can make this claim, it's really big, it's really cool. But again, you have to like be very careful in how you wield it, because it's a super powerful thing. So what do I mean by essence? Okay. And essence basically is, at least for the purpose of this video and for our class, is a quality or maybe a set of qualities that a class needs in order to be that thing. They need the essence in order to be that thing. Inversely, if we want to state it negatively, if you lacked this essence, you would not be that particular thing. Okay, so it's what you need to have to be that thing. So I think the easiest example is in something like chemistry. uh, Carbon's essential quality is that it has 6 protons. Now, maybe we should add bonded together in a certain way, or 6 protons in a nucleus or something like that, but let's just say 6 protons. Why is that an essential quality? Well, listen, if carbon had 5 protons, then it wouldn't be carbon anymore. It would be boron. Or if it had 6 protons, it wouldn't be carbon, it would be nitrogen. Like literally, that's what it means for it to be carbon, to have an atomic number of 6, to have 6 protons. Now, I think that that's a really strong example of an essence, because if you change that thing, you don't have carbon anymore. The question is whether there are many other terms that have those same kinds of things, right? Whether there are many other terms that have those same kinds of definitions. But the essence, whenever we're trying to offer a good definition, we are trying to, as much as possible, get close to that essence. Now, we might not get the essence because there might be exceptions to the rule, or there might be something that we can't quite get a universal claim. But if we can get 70, 80, 90% of the class with our term, depending on the context, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. So we're trying to, as much as possible, get to those universal standards. We're trying to, as much as possible, get to the essence of a term. But even if we can't get all the way there, we can just say, hey, this definition isn't perfect. I'm obviously excluding some things, and maybe my exclusion is not good. Maybe actually this definition isn't like we need to find a better way of doing this because of the things that I've excluded. But nonetheless, I can still talk about 90% of the cases, and that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Okay. So whenever you hear all, none, never, in all cases, and no cases, that should alert you. Universal claim. Easy potentially to undermine if I find a counterexample. Anytime that I talk about essence, or maybe necessary or sufficient, although we'll talk about those later, that should also alert you that someone is trying to get to the qualities that something needs to have. So let's go back to our definition of human there, and our intentional definition of animals with a capacity for reason and recursive language that form complex political communities. Okay. Now, the question that we could ask with respect to this is, well, could any human lack these things? So, are there any humans that lack the capacity for reason or lack the capacity for recursive language? Are there any humans that don't have membership in some sort of complex political community? If yes, then we have to decide, how are we going to modify the list of properties in that definition? Okay. Are we going to add are we going to add some sort of qualification? Are we just going to say, oh, this talks about most cases, although there are some really bad things, or it's bad of me because I'm excluding certain things? We could do that. But the whole point, again, is to, whenever we're considering definitions, considering whether we're actually capturing the thing. One of the other things here, I could see a poet, and maybe a poet isn't a good writer of logical definitions, but maybe a poet could be like, what does this say about love? What does this say about friendship? What does this say about appreciating beauty? Maybe there are other things that we want to include in humanity that make us human, that should be included in the definition of humanity. Stuff that we just haven't even considered, right? Similarly, with the extensional definition, where we're just listing people, Plato, Diogenes, Hipparchia, Megan the Stallion, Flea, right? The question there is this exhaustive? Am I excluding humans by not enumerating enough, right? Are there things that I'm letting in that I shouldn't let in on this particular definition? So these things are kind of like up for criticism. That's what it means to be a critical thinker, to realize that whenever someone is using an intentional definition, we're looking at the sense or the connotation, we're looking at the properties, and we're trying to figure out whether that property, that set of properties, really does define what it means to be that term. Or if someone is offering an extensional definition via ostension and they're pointing at the particular things, or they're enumerating a class of things and all of the objects in it, we need to make sure that what is inside the class should be inside the class, and what hasn't been mentioned should not be mentioned, right? Because if there's something that has been excluded that should be included, that extensional definition is wrong. Or if there's something that is included in the extension but shouldn't be, that extensional definition is wrong. So that's kind of how we deal with stuff. When we're criticizing intensional definitions, we're trying to figure out whether the properties actually get at the essence of the thing. When we're criticizing extensional definitions, we're trying to make sure that what is included in the class should be included, what is excluded should be excluded. Okay. Now here's some interesting patterns, and this might help you to think about the difference between intension and extension. Intension and extension should be thought about for every single term, and generally speaking, they have inverse correlations with each other. So what I mean by that is if you have an increasing extension, usually you have a decreasing intension, okay? So if your class of objects gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that means your extension is increasing. Then typically speaking, your intension is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So consider what happens if we're talking about all students at the University of Louisville versus all students in the world. We can say way more things that students at the University of Louisville have in common than all students in the world. They probably have fewer things in common. Does that make sense? So as the extension increases, we can say fewer things about what those things have in common. If the extension stays relatively small, then we probably can say more things that has in common, and that's the second thing. As the intension increases, the extension typically decreases. So as you specify more and more the intension of a term, that typically is going to shrink the class of objects that you're referring to. So as your intention becomes more and more specific, you're giving more and more properties for the definition, you are shrinking the class of objects that term points out. So for example, people, if we think about how many objects that would pick out, that is way different than bilingual homeowners. That is going to pick out way fewer people. So as the intention increased in those terms, because we've gone from people to bilingual homeowners, we've increased the intention. That's led to the extension decreasing. So typically they have an inverse relationship with one another. More perplexing, and I think Baronet, the guy who I mentioned, his textbook is solid. Whenever I teach logic, I use it. Terms might lack intension or extension, okay? Now, Baronet thinks that terms can lack extension, but not intention. I think they can actually lack intention, at least in a certain way. And I'm going to kind of explain that. So terms could lack extension in the following way. So maybe this is controversial, but we could think about Bigfoot, okay? Or we could think about any sort of cryptid. Intentionally, we could specify a lot about them. So if we take Bigfoot, they're a primate, they're hairy, they're bipedal, and they have big old feet, right? So we can say a lot about them. We have a good connotation or a sense of what the term Bigfoot means. But the extension? Are there actual big feet anywhere? Some people say yes, some people say no, right? So it's possible to have an intention without having an extension, meaning it's possible to think about something and to be able to specify properties without being able to find a tangible example of it, okay? Now, I think this is the more controversial one, but I think that this is also important to talk about. I think that terms might lack intention, and what I mean here is in lab sciences, sometimes you have like anomalous data, or sometimes you have really weird stuff that you don't know what to do with, and you can't quite explain what's going on with it. So you have these actual objects or these actual things that don't really fit in with your theory or fit in with your ability to make observations or anything like that. So you have examples, you have an extension, but intentionally you can't really explain what's going on there. And sometimes that leads to what are called paradigm shifts in science. The anomalous data, the exceptions, there just starts to become so many of them that you come up with a theory that can explain that as well as what explains the old theory, and that leads to a completely new theory that kind of like takes everything in. Okay, so terms can lack extension. If they lack extension, what that means is they have intension. You can talk about the properties, you can talk about the sense without thinking that there's any given example. And I think that terms might also lack intention in the sense that sometimes you just have anomalies. Sometimes you have weird stuff that you can point to, but it's really difficult to describe. So intention and extension can come apart in interesting ways. Okay. So what do we do with potential disagreement about definitions? Well, I think that one of the things that we should do, and this is kind of like one of the core lessons. We're almost finished with this particular video. Um, One of the things that we can ask is whether we're talking about cognitive meaning. What I mean by cognitive meaning is we're really focusing on information, stuff that we could be right or wrong about. Because cognitive meaning very much differs from something like emotive meaning. So, whenever we're having disagreements about words or a definition or an argument, one of the things that we need to make sure that we're doing is we have the same goals for talking about what we're talking about. This is why I was saying, like, we're talking about logic, we're talking about critical thinking, we're talking about rhetoric, we're talking about the uses of language to convey information in that nonfiction sort of way. Because if we're not clear about focusing on that cognitive meaning, on the information, on the stuff that can be true or false, we might actually be having some sort of like emotional disagreement. Maybe we actually agree, but like our emotions are completely opposite. So we need to be careful that the purpose for what we're doing whenever we're having these debates or making these definitions is very much clear, right? Similarly, one of the things that we should probably distinguish is whether we're having a factual dispute rather than a verbal dispute. And so what a factual dispute is it's a disagreement about the information. It's a disagreement about the facts. And I know that's a little bit circular, but the idea is we just haven't gotten the information right. We haven't got the data right. We're not talking about stuff in the same way. Factual disputes, it's pretty clear how you resolve that. If you are thinking that there is whiskey in this cup, you could run tests on this. Unfortunately, it is just mint tea. To help me, you can kind of see the tea back as well. Yeah, it's just mint tea to help soothe my throat when I'm talking through the video, right? Whereas if it's just a verbal dispute, there's not really any facts that you need to bring in. Basically, what you need to do is just figure out what terms you're uh, using to talk about the meanings of what's going on. Okay, there it's just maybe in a strange way, just semantics. You're just disagreeing on the terms. You're not disagreeing on anything substantive. So whenever you're having disagreements about definitions, one of the things that you need to figure out is whether it's a really deep disagreement about the facts or the information or whatever else it is, or whether it's relatively superficial and you're calling it one thing and I'm calling it another, right? You know, you're calling it. I was just trying to think of like a term that two people would disagree, would talk about it. Maybe you're calling it whiskey and I'm calling it bourbon. And yeah, there's more strict definitions with respect to those words, but it just turns out that one of us is using the word in the wrong way. We actually agree on the core information. The disagreement is something relatively superficial. Okay, so make sure that we're talking about cognitive meaning or the information. Make sure that the dispute is kind of like informational, because if it's about something else, the disagreement is just like not going to be resolved by further information, right? You resolve cognitive disagreements, you resolve factual disagreements with more information or finding a way to figure out what you need to figure out. You don't resolve emotional disputes with more information. You don't resolve verbal disputes with more information. You resolve emotional disputes through empathy, through figuring out what's going on, figuring out the motivations of why someone is talking, figure out what's going on in their particular life, right? You figure out the verbal disputes by creating terms, by negotiating the vocabulary that you use, not with more information. And so I wanted to close this slide with a couple of questions that very often come up in class. Sometimes students will say, well, isn't this just like all semantics? Yeah, I guess kind of in a certain way. But very often, what students mean when they say, "Isn't this all semantics?" What they're very often saying is, "This doesn't matter." Uh, uh, all we're doing is we are picking apart words. We're not getting into anything substantial here. But I think that's while that sometimes can be the case. PR very often is this case. Marketing is very often this case. You're disagreeing about the words that should be used. But in philosophy, in politics, in law, a lot of times you're dealing with something much deeper, and it's not all semantics. There is some sort of substantive issue, a deep issue that you're trying to get at. Similarly, some people will often say, "Well, doesn't it depend on who's speaking? Like if I say, I don't feel rich, uh, that I very much depends. It's called an indexical term. It depends on who's talking." And I think yeah, that's kind of that's true. It can very much depend on the speaker, but rich is a term that can have maybe better and worse definitions of it, right? If someone like Jeff Bezos said that they weren't rich, we would think that there's something really weird going on with his definition of rich, right? If a business owner who had a $5 million stock portfolio and like a $10 million mansion or whatever else, whatever it is, said that they weren't rich, we would think that they're saying something really weird about being rich. um so yes, it can depend on who's speaking, but there can be better and worse uses of a particular word. So let's try and come to some takeaway points, right? The takeaway points are, again, remember that distinction between the natural language, the object language, and the formal language, or the language that we're using to analyze what's going on, right? Think about the difference between intension and extension. But whenever we're trying to figure out good definitions, and again, I'm giving a little bit of a hat tip. HT means hat tip to Stan Baronet, who wrote a influential logic textbook, because he offers similar things at the end of one of his chapters for making good definitions. But I think that good definitions very often get at the heart or the essence of the term. And I'm going to say as simple as possible. Now, sometimes definitions aren't simple. Sometimes it's complex. My definition of human, right, being someone with the capacity for reason and recursive language, and forming political, complex political communities. There's a lot going on in that definition, but it's because defining what it means to be human is really complicated. So sometimes you're talking about a really complex phenomenon that needs a complex definition. That's okay, right? But sometimes you can find pretty simple essences. So, for example, carbon. Carbon has 6 protons. That's like a pretty solid, elegant definition, right? So you always want your definition to get to the essence of the term, or get as close as possible to the most important qualities that you're trying to get at. You want your definition to be neither too broad nor too narrow. I think this is very easily seen in the example of the extension. Remember that diagram of the classes? The class is creating the circle that the objects go inside, and you're excluding other objects. You want to make sure that that circle is neither too broad, meaning it lets things in that shouldn't be in there, nor too narrow, meaning that it's excluding things that should be inside of there. You want your definition to fit the phenomena that you're trying to describe and exclude the phenomena that you're not trying to describe or define in this particular thing. Generally speaking, you want to favor affirmative or positive things over negative things, meaning you want to say what something has as opposed to what it lacks. Now, not all definitions, but most definitions, it's much better to be positive or affirmative rather than negative. And you might also want to specify the speaker or the context. So I use that example of figure, right? So I could say for mathematics, figure means a diagram, or figure means a drawing of something, right? By saying for mathematics, what I'm doing there is I'm specifying the context. What I'm doing is I'm saying I'm not interested in all senses of this particular term. I'm only interested in a mathematical definition of this particular term. So very often it's important to specify who's talking, or you could say for me, What I mean by a worthwhile life is this. If I say, for me, what I'm saying is, I'm not trying to decide this issue for anyone who's not me. But what I can do is I can say what I genuinely believe. So anytime that you're specifying speaker or context, what you can do is basically just say what you're trying to say and what you're not trying to say. Now sometimes we can go beyond that, because if we do too much qualification, we're kind of like taking our definitions down too much. We do want to be big and impactful in kind of the things that we say, but we also want to be disciplined and not like overbearing or exclusionary or anything like that. It's a very delicate balance in a lot of these things. And lastly, and I think this is really important in debates, it's very often the case that whenever we're looking at definitions, we have multiple definitions of terms. And so just as a little bit of a tip, sometimes it's okay to just make a comparative judgment. So if I have 3 definitions of term, I can say, I like definition 3. I think it captures what I want to capture in the meaning of the term. Definitions 1 and 2 don't work for me, but definition 3 does. Is definition 3 perfect? No. But I think definition 3 is better than the alternatives. Sometimes making that comparative judgment based on what options are on the table, what extant definitions there are, that's okay. Now, because you realize it isn't perfect, maybe you can come up with a 4th definition. That would be even better if you could find a perfect definition for you. But sometimes, especially in complex stuff, being less wrong is improvement, even if you're not perfectly right, right? Having a less false theory is better, or having a less false theory is pretty good, even if you can't get that full capital T truth, completely comprehensive. It works in all cases, right? So the comparative judgments are sometimes okay. All right. So the challenge for you, if you really feel like you understood what I'm talking about here, you should be able to answer these kinds of questions. If given a term, could you offer both intentional and extensional definitions? So remember, intention, the sense or the connotation of the term, talking about the properties, getting at the concept of the term, versus the extensional definition, where you're talking about the class of objects that something picks out. Ostension, you're pointing, or you're listing, or you're making classes and subclasses. Another question that I think you should be able to answer, this is a little bit more difficult. What is one debate that you think hinges on the definition of a specific term? Now, I could think of a lot, but think about debates, think about terms that are really important for that debate, and how a lot of debates, especially the ones that I have in mind, and feel free to put them in the comments or talk with me or whatever, but debates that it seems like if people had the same definition, or if they could agree on the same definition, it would basically resolve the debate. And then the third one, and I think this is probably like the most abstract, but also kind of like important here, thinking about the difference between intensions and extensions. Which one do you prefer? If someone is offering you a definition of a term, would you rather they have an intentional definition or an extensional definition? Now, ideally, they would have both, right? But whenever you're thinking through things, do you think intentional definitions are more helpful or extensional definitions? Is it more helpful to think about the properties and the concept, the connotation? Or is it more helpful for you to think about the denotation, the reference, the class of objects that's being picked out? Why? Why does it seem like intentional or extensional is more important to you? And does it vary depending on the context that we're dealing with? So this is just to say, definitions are really important. If you have strong definitions in your argument, that can really strengthen your argument. If you have weak definitions because of ambiguity or vagueness, that can really decrease the strength of an argument. Moreover, when you're making definitions, you can shift between intension and extension, or you can use both to help you to clarify what's going on in the words that you're using. That's the whole point, to be careful with words, because words are magic. They can help to convey things to a lot of different audiences. And you, as an expert, potentially can help to you can learn about your audience, and you can bring your audience to a sufficient level of understanding where they will be able to understand what you're trying to get them to believe, or what you're trying to get them to connect the evidence to the conclusion. But definitions are a really, really, really important part of critical thinking and language, and paying attention to especially the most central words that people seem to come back to time and time again, because that's a really central part of understanding an argument. Thanks for your time. I'll see y'all next time.